January 14, 1979, New York City. Thomas DeSimone was reported missing. He was 28 years old, a Lucchese crime family associate, and a participant in one of the largest robbery crews operating around New York during the 1970s. His wife, Cookie, reported his disappearance to police. DeSimone was never seen again, and his body was never recovered. Time 1. For years, his disappearance remained surrounded by conflicting accounts. Some accounts connected his death to the Lufthansa robbery at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Others placed the motive years earlier, in two murders that had created a dangerous problem between the Lucchese and Gambino organizations. What is established is simpler. Thomas DeSimone vanished, and by the time he disappeared, he had accumulated enemies inside the very world that had once protected him. DeSimone had grown up in Brooklyn and became involved with organized crime while still young. He eventually became associated with the Lucchese crime family's Vario crew, operating around the Brooklyn and Queens underworld dominated by Paul Vario. Among the people around that crew was Henry Hill, another Lucchese associate who would eventually become a government informant. James Burke was also part of that circle. Burke was not a made member of the Italian Mafia. He was an Irish-American associate of the Lucchese organization, but his connections to the Vario crew gave him access to the same criminal network. He became known for robbery, gambling, cargo theft, and other criminal enterprises. Penguin Random House, 2. DeSimone became one of Burke's trusted associates. That relationship would eventually become central to the mystery surrounding his disappearance. But DeSimone's reputation was already becoming a liability. The most important documented episode occurred in 1970. William "Billy" Batts Bentvena was a Gambino crime family associate who had served a prison sentence. After his release, a welcome home gathering took place at Robert's Lounge, a location associated with Burke. According to Henry Hill's later account, Bentvena encountered DeSimone and made a remark about DeSimone's earlier work shining shoes. The exchange escalated. On June 11, 1970, Bentvena was beaten and killed. Hill's account places DeSimone, James Burke, and Henry Hill in the events surrounding the murder. The killing became one of the most consequential acts of violence associated with DeSimone. There was a problem. Bentvena was not simply another street criminal. He was connected to the Gambino organization, and DeSimone had allegedly killed him without authorization from the people who ultimately had the power to decide whether a made Gambino associate could be murdered. That distinction mattered. The Mafia was violent, but violence inside organized crime was not supposed to be completely uncontrolled. A murder involving a made member could create consequences far beyond the immediate participants. DeSimone's actions had therefore created a debt that did not disappear simply because years passed. Then came another murder. Ronald "Foxy" Giroux, a Gambino associate, was also killed. Accounts later provided by Henry Hill connected DeSimone to the killing. The exact circumstances and chronology have been disputed in published accounts, but the broader allegation became important because Gambino interests were believed to have regarded DeSimone as responsible for the deaths of their associates. Crime Library 4. For DeSimone, the danger was not necessarily immediate. He remained active. He continued working with Burke and the Vario crew, and by the middle of the 1970s, that group had moved into increasingly lucrative criminal operations. One of those operations involved cargo theft at airports. Another involved a robbery that would eventually become legendary. The target was Lufthansa Airlines. The information came through Martin Krugman, a bookmaker and associate of Henry Hill. Krugman had learned that Lufthansa transported large quantities of American and foreign currency through its cargo operation at JFK Airport. The information was connected to an airport employee, Louis Werner, who had gambling debts and knowledge of the facility. Wikipedia 5. Burke recognized the opportunity. The robbery was organized around a small group of men. DeSimone was among them. On December 11, 1978, the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport was robbed. The original estimate had been roughly $2 million, but the actual haul was approximately $5. $875 million in cash and jewelry, making it one of the largest cash robberies in American history at the time. Wikipedia 5. The scale of the robbery created a new problem. Too many people knew about it, and too much money had entered a criminal organization that survived through secrecy. Law enforcement immediately began investigating. The FBI and New York authorities were confronted with a robbery in which the perpetrators had carefully concealed their identities. But investigators soon began connecting people in Burke's circle to the crime. One detail became particularly important. According to contemporary reporting, an employee who had encountered one of the masked robbers remembered the man's highly polished shoes. DeSimone was known for his appearance and his habit of wearing polished shoes, and investigators considered him a suspect. Time. 1. The robbery therefore brought new attention to a man who already had a violent reputation. Then the people around the robbery began dying or disappearing. Stephen Edwards was found dead in his New York apartment. Other individuals connected to the operation would disappear or be murdered in the months that followed. Contemporary reporting described the situation as a deadly dispute among the participants over the distribution of the Lufthansa proceeds. Time. 1. The violence was becoming impossible to separate from the robbery. And then DeSimone disappeared. On January 14, 1979, his wife reported him missing. There was no confirmed body, no publicly established murder scene, no recovered remains. But federal investigators had their own theory. A contemporary report published in March 1979 stated that the FBI believed DeSimone had been murdered in a dispute among the thieves over the Lufthansa money. New York police were less certain and had not conclusively established that he was dead. Time. 1. That distinction is critical. The historical record does not establish a recovered body or a definitive murder scene. What later made the case even darker was Henry Hill's account. Hill eventually became a government informant after his own criminal activities, and the investigation surrounding him placed him in serious legal danger. His cooperation helped federal authorities obtain numerous convictions against organized crime figures. Biography 6. According to Hill's later account, DeSimone's disappearance was connected not simply to the Lufthansa robbery, but to the older killings of Billy Batts and Ronald Giroux. The theory was that Gambino interests had never forgotten those murders. And now DeSimone had become increasingly exposed. He had participated in a spectacular airport robbery. His name had entered the investigation. People around the robbery were being killed. And the man who knew him best was beginning to understand that the protection of the street had limits. The Lufthansa money had created chaos. But the older blood feud may have created something even more dangerous. By January 1979, Thomas DeSimone was gone. And somewhere inside New York's organized crime network, someone had apparently decided that the man who had once been useful was no longer worth protecting. The problem was that the surviving evidence could not tell investigators exactly who made that decision. And that uncertainty would follow the DeSimone case for decades. January 14, 1979, Thomas DeSimone was gone, and the investigation had no body to examine, no confirmed murder scene to reconstruct, and no definitive forensic evidence establishing exactly how he had died. But the disappearance did not occur in isolation. The Lufthansa robbery had begun producing consequences throughout the criminal network surrounding James Burke, and investigators were watching as people connected to the robbery became victims themselves. The robbery had taken place only weeks earlier, on December 11, 1978. The money was enormous. The consequences were larger. The stolen cash and jewelry could not simply be deposited into a bank account. The participants had to spend it, conceal it, distribute it, or move it through other criminal channels. Every person who knew the location of the money became a potential liability. And Burke understood the problem. The robbery had been successful. The aftermath was not. According to later accounts, Burke began eliminating people connected to the operation. The murders were not random acts of violence. They were part of an attempt to protect the robbery's proceeds and prevent information from reaching law enforcement. The first major victim was Parnell Stacks Edwards. Edwards was a musician and associate who had been recruited to dispose of the getaway vehicle used during the Lufthansa robbery. Instead of abandoning the van as instructed, Edwards reportedly took it to his own neighborhood and parked it there. Police eventually found the vehicle. The mistake created a direct link between the robbery and people who had previously been outside the investigation. Edwards was later found murdered in his apartment. His death demonstrated the danger surrounding anyone who mishandled the operation. The pattern continued. Louis Werner, the airport employee who had provided information about Lufthansa's procedures, eventually became a target of the federal investigation. Werner had gambling debts and had supplied information that helped the robbers understand the movement of money through the airport. His cooperation with the criminals eventually became known to investigators. The FBI had been working toward identifying the people behind the robbery, and Werner became one of the most important links between the inside information and the criminal organization that exploited it. In May 1979, Werner was arrested. The Lufthansa investigation was no longer simply an inquiry into an unsolved airport robbery. Federal authorities were beginning to build a criminal case, and the people around Burke were under increasing pressure. Thomas DeSimone was already missing. The question was why. One explanation came from Henry Hill. Years later, after becoming a cooperating witness, Hill described DeSimone as a violent and unpredictable figure whose behavior had created problems inside the organization. But Hill's testimony and later accounts must be separated carefully from what was independently established by investigators. The murder of Billy Batts was real. Batts was a Gambino associate. DeSimone was identified in later accounts as one of the men responsible for his death. But the exact circumstances surrounding DeSimone's own death were never proven in court. That distinction became increasingly important as the years passed. The mythology surrounding the Lufthansa robbery grew larger than the evidence itself. Later books, films, and television programs presented certain events as settled facts, even though some remained allegations or witness accounts. For investigators, however, there was one fact they could not ignore. DeSimone had disappeared, and his disappearance came during a period in which people connected to Burke's criminal operation were being systematically eliminated. The killings attracted enormous attention. The FBI had already begun pursuing the Lufthansa robbery, while New York authorities were examining the murders connected to its aftermath. The investigation also revealed something larger about organized crime in New York. The robbery was not simply the work of independent thieves. It existed inside an established network. Paul Vario's crew had connections to the Lucchese crime family. Burke had access to organized crime figures, bookmakers, thieves, and corrupt or compromised individuals. The airport robbery therefore demonstrated how traditional mafia structures could intersect with independent criminals. The participants did not all have the same formal status. Some were made members. Others were associates. Some, like Burke, were powerful criminals without being formally inducted into the Italian-American Mafia. But the criminal relationships were valuable, and the money created a common interest, until the money became a source of suspicion. By 1979, federal authorities had begun turning pressure on the people surrounding the robbery. Werner's arrest was followed by the prosecution of other figures connected to the operation. The FBI also received information from informants and witnesses who could explain the structure behind the robbery. One of the most important would eventually be Henry Hill. Hill had spent years inside the Vario crew's orbit. He knew Burke. He knew DeSimone. He knew how the Lufthansa operation had been organized, and he knew what happened afterward. But Hill's cooperation did not come immediately. His criminal activities continued after the Lufthansa robbery. He was involved in drug trafficking, and that decision would ultimately destroy his relationship with the Lucchese organization. Drug dealing carried particular danger because made Mafia members were traditionally prohibited from trafficking narcotics. The reason was practical. Drug charges could produce severe federal sentences. A person arrested for narcotics could become a government witness. That was exactly what happened with Hill. In 1980, Hill was arrested on narcotics charges. He realized that the organization had little reason to protect him. He began cooperating with federal authorities, and once he started talking, the internal history of the Vario crew began to emerge. Hill's cooperation became a major turning point. He provided information about the Lufthansa robbery, organized crime activity, and murders. His testimony helped prosecutors understand how Burke's criminal network operated. The federal case against the participants became increasingly serious. In 1980, Burke was arrested on charges connected to the Lufthansa robbery. But the case was not yet finished. The government still needed to establish what had happened to the missing money, who had participated in the robbery, and which murders could be tied to the organization. The investigation continued while Burke remained a central figure. Then came another development. The FBI and federal prosecutors began using Hill's information to pursue the larger criminal organization surrounding him. The Lufthansa robbery had initially appeared to be a spectacular but isolated theft. It was becoming evidence of something much broader, a network of racketeering, extortion, theft, gambling, narcotics trafficking, and murder. The federal government had spent years developing tools to attack organized crime. Now those tools were being used against the people who had operated around Vario and Burke. And the danger was moving closer to the men who had believed they were protected. For DeSimone, it was already too late. He had vanished before the federal case reached its final stages. His name would later appear in accounts from people who claimed to know what had happened. But investigators never recovered his body. No court convicted anyone specifically for murdering Thomas DeSimone. That means one conclusion must remain cautious. It is historically reasonable to connect DeSimone's disappearance to the violent collapse surrounding the Lufthansa robbery and his earlier conflict with Gambino associates. It is not historically responsible to present every later account as proven fact. The difference matters, because the story eventually told about DeSimone became cleaner than the evidence actually was. The real history was messy. There were competing motives. There were informants. There were murders. There was a massive robbery. And there were people who disappeared before they could ever be questioned in court. Meanwhile, Henry Hill was becoming increasingly valuable to federal investigators. He could describe the people, he could describe the relationships, and he could explain how the Vario crew operated. The government's case against the organization was no longer dependent entirely upon surveillance or physical evidence. It had something more dangerous: an insider. Hill's cooperation eventually helped prosecutors bring charges against numerous organized crime figures. The federal government strategy was changing. Rather than treating each robbery or murder as a separate event, prosecutors could present organized crime as an interconnected system. And the Lufthansa robbery was one of the most visible examples. The robbery had generated millions of dollars. It had generated murders. It had generated informants. And it had eventually generated federal convictions. For James Burke, the walls were closing in. For Henry Hill, cooperation offered a way out. For Paul Vario and the Lucchese organization, the investigation threatened to expose years of criminal activity. And for Thomas DeSimone, the consequences had already arrived. He had entered the criminal world as a young associate. He had become involved with violent men. He had participated in murders according to later witness accounts. He had taken part in one of the most notorious robberies in New York history. Then he disappeared, but the federal investigation was only beginning to reveal what the robbery had done to the organization behind it. And when prosecutors finally began turning the evidence from the Lufthansa case into convictions, the surviving members of the crew would discover that the most dangerous witness was not a police officer. It was the man who had once stood beside them. Henry Hill was ready to testify, and his testimony would help turn the Lufthansa robbery from an unsolved crime into the beginning of the end for the men who had carried it out. By the time federal investigators were examining the violence surrounding the Lufthansa robbery, Thomas DeSimone had already disappeared. The FBI maintains a public file on DeSimone, confirming that he was the subject of federal investigative records. But the existence of an FBI file does not solve the central mystery. DeSimone's body was never recovered, and the historical record does not provide a criminal conviction establishing exactly who killed him. That uncertainty is important. The story has often been repeated as though the ending were completely settled. DeSimone supposedly crossed the wrong people, became a liability, and was eliminated by men from his own criminal world. There is evidence supporting parts of that narrative, but there is also a line that cannot responsibly be crossed. An allegation is not a conviction. A cooperating witness's account is not automatically the same thing as independently proven evidence. And a missing body leaves investigators without the physical evidence that could establish precisely how the victim died. What can be established is the environment surrounding his disappearance. The Lufthansa robbery had placed extraordinary pressure on the criminal network connected to James Burke. The robbery at Kennedy Airport became one of the most notorious organized crime cases of the period, and its aftermath produced murders, disappearances, arrests, and years of investigation. The FBI's own historical material concerning the Lufthansa case describes the enormous scale of the operation and the involvement of multiple law enforcement agencies. The problem was not simply recovering stolen money. Investigators had to determine who had planned the robbery, who had supplied information, who had participated directly, and what happened to the proceeds afterward. The investigation crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Kennedy Airport was principally under the authority of the Port Authority Police, while federal, state, and local agencies became involved as the investigation expanded. The FBI later described the case as an example of the extraordinary difficulties involved in coordinating a major investigation across multiple agencies. That complexity gave the criminals time, but it also gave investigators more opportunities to build connections. Every witness represented another potential lead. Every criminal association could become evidence. Every murder surrounding the robbery created another question. And every person who disappeared made the remaining survivors more important. DeSimone became part of that history without ever receiving a confirmed final chapter. His disappearance has frequently been connected to the murder of Billy Batts, a Gambino associate whose killing was later described by Henry Hill. That connection has become one of the most persistent explanations for DeSimone's fate. Yet there is a difference between saying Hill later described DeSimone's killing and saying a court proved that DeSimone was killed for that reason. The first statement concerns a documented account. The second would require evidence that does not exist in the public historical record. That distinction changes the story. It means the mystery is not simply who ordered the murder. It is also what can actually be proven about the murder itself. The answer is limited. DeSimone disappeared in January 1979. His body was never recovered. No murderer was convicted for his death, and the exact circumstances remain unresolved. The people around him, however, continued to experience the consequences of the criminal world they had helped build. The Lufthansa robbery remained under investigation for decades. In 2014, federal prosecutors announced an indictment against Bonanno crime family captain Vincent Acero, alleging his participation in the 1978 Lufthansa robbery at Kennedy Airport. The FBI's archived announcement described the case as part of a broader racketeering investigation involving organized crime. The development was remarkable because the original robbery had occurred more than 35 years earlier. The investigation had survived generations of criminals. But the prosecution ultimately demonstrated another important limitation. An indictment is an accusation. It is not a conviction. Acero was later acquitted of the Lufthansa robbery charges. That result is another reminder of why historical crime documentaries must separate what prosecutors alleged from what a jury ultimately accepted. The Lufthansa robbery was real. The money was real. The investigation was real. The criminal network surrounding it was real. But not every allegation produced a conviction. And that same caution applies to Thomas DeSimone. The FBI's continued preservation of his records demonstrates that his criminal activities and his association with organized crime were matters of federal interest. But the final act remains outside the courtroom. There is no confirmed grave, no verified death scene, no convicted killer, only the disappearance of a man whose life had become intertwined with a violent criminal network. That may be the darkest part of the story. DeSimone entered a world where violence could solve problems temporarily. But violence also created new problems. A robbery required secrecy. Secrecy required silence. Silence required fear. And fear eventually turned people against one another. The same criminal environment that had made DeSimone useful could also make him expendable. That is not a fictional lesson. It is visible throughout the documented history of organized crime. Men who once worked together became witnesses against one another. Associates became informants. Criminal partners became defendants. And people who knew too much sometimes vanished before they could ever tell their stories in court. Thomas DeSimone was one of those missing pieces. His name remains attached to one of the most notorious robbery crews in New York's history. But his final fate remains a question rather than a proven conclusion. And that is where the historical record must end. Not with an invented murder scene, not with imaginary dialogue, not with a fictional confession, with uncertainty, because the Mafia's greatest weapon was never simply the gun. It was silence. And in Thomas DeSimone's case, The silence lasted long enough that the final truth disappeared with him.